So welcome back everyone to another Battlefield Tours with Rob Woolsey. Today we are traveling to Operation Plunder and Varsity across the Rhine. So we are very grateful that Rob is available to have another Battlefield Tour with us and look out monthly for his Battlefield Tours. So over to you, Rob.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. So tonight we're going to talk about Operation Plunder and Varsity, which was the two code names for the two operations for the crossing of the Rhine in 1945, and actually in March of 1945, which is very appropriate for our talk this month. So Military Family Services Europe is not affiliated with any of the companies, products, apps, or anything I talk about, and they don't sponsor or endorse anything that I talk about. These are anything I recommend is stuff that I use as a battlefield tour guide, and I would recommend to you if you're going on a tour. So what we're going to talk about is a quick country overview. In this case, we're going to talk about Germany, some recommended preparations, the travel advisories, a few helpful words which are important when you're getting ready to do a battlefield tour. And then we're going to actually give you an overview of what Operation Plunder and Varsity were, because they were actually massive military operations. And then we're going to talk about Operation Plunder and the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade's role in the crossing of the Rhine. And then we're going to talk about Operation Varsity, and we're going to talk about a unit that I don't normally talk about, which is the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. They only have a couple of actions that are near Canadians at any time in the war, even though they are actually a Canadian unit. And they serve actually in the British 6th Airborne Division for the entire war. And then we're going to talk about the end of Varsity and Plunder, and then anything that's worth mention after that. So we are in the country of Germany and the region of the North Rhine-Westphalia. It's a population of about 18,152 people. Of course, language is German, and the main airports to where we're going to be is just like the one we did for Operation Veritable and Blockbuster, which is Dusseldorf and Wies airports. So Rees is actually the oldest town in the lower Rhine region of Germany, and it was founded in about 1228 in its current state. But the first Frankish settlement, they believe, happened between 5 and 800 AD. And it has been occupied and fought over many, many times over the centuries in different wars, 100 Years' War, 30 Years' War, things like that. And by the Second World War, it actually had been completely destroyed by the Allied bombing that happened on the 16th of February, making Rees one of the most destroyed cities in Europe. It and Basel were utterly flattened. Germany is the 9th most expensive country in Europe, so the costs are higher than the average. So that's something to take into consideration when you're traveling to Europe, is how much things are going to cost in comparison to what you're used to paying. And a cool fact, at the turn of the century, the population of Rees was only 4,096 people, and the town still had city walls from medieval times, and those have all been extensively rebuilt to their original state, with many features from its long history, including lots of wells and things in town, which is a festival that they have every year. It is also known for an extensive promenade along the Rhine River with lots of restaurants and cafes, which is always very much enjoyable after a long day of touring. So, North Rhine-Westphalia is generally a mild climate with cool, wet winters and warmer, dry summers. The best time really is the end of April to the end of October. Anything outside of that, you're getting into some really wet and quite muddy and unpleasant type of weather. Always bring a rain jacket. It is Europe, as Mickey said, it likes to rain a lot. It's always a good idea. It also helps break the wind, and you always want good footwear when you're walking around on any battlefield tour, because a lot of the places you're going are going to be trails, cobblestones. A lot of memorials and cemeteries are all grass, so you want good footwear to walk around. Always travel with travel insurance. It's really important, and medical insurance. It's not worth the risk. And all the memorials and cemeteries are child friendly, and most of the restaurants in Europe, I found, are also child friendly and pet friendly, which is important if you're taking your pet with you. So always check the Government of Canada travel advice before you're going to any country on tour, because you need to know what your high risks are and your low risks are. Of course, there's no more COVID entry requirements, which is kind of nice. There is no visa requirements for any countries from the EU, but there is a maximum 90-day stay from Canada if you are coming to do on battlefield touring. Petty crime is always a risk, but generally this part of Germany is quite safe. There are also some hospitals. Sonsbeck, Xanten have two of them. Rees, Wesel also have hospitals as well. The emergency number is 112, and your closest consulate, in case something goes wrong, is Dusseldorf. So Operation Plunder and Varsity overview. Now, After the long and heavy slog of Operation Veritable and Blockbuster, the 1st Canadian Army was now to take a backseat role in the upcoming crossing of the Rhine. But there was Canadian participation in the plan to get across this mighty river, and that was a detachment of the 2nd Canadian Corps from the 1st Canadian Army and from the 2nd Canadian Corps detaching the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, and it was attached to the British 30 Corps, which is quite a famous corps in the Second World War. It fought at Operation Market Garden. Well, it fought first in Normandy, then the Great Swan, the race across Belgium into the Netherlands and Germany. Then it fought in Operation Market Garden, and then it fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and then it sat out Operation Veritable. Sorry, it participated in Operation Veritable. Sorry, it didn't say that out. It participated in Veritable. So it's quite a busy unit under the command of Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks. Overall, by the 10th of March 1945, the United States 9th, 1st, and 3rd Armies from north to south were pressed against the west bank of the Rhine River, which was the last major obstacle to get into the heart of Germany. The Supreme Allied Commander Powers Europe, General Dwight D. Eisenhower's broad front strategy was about to take its ultimate form, and that all the two army groups, the British 21st Army Group under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and the U.S. 12th Army Group under General Omar Bradley, were about to assault across the Rhine. The main effort, so to speak, was going to be the 21st Army Group's area because it was the best country to sweep around and capture the major industrial areas of the Ruhr, thus crippling the Germans' ability to wage war. But with the U.S. First Army's capture of the Lunendorf Bridge at the town of Remagen on the 7th of March 1945, it was decided to keep pressing forward there as well, even with the bridge's eventual collapse on the 17th of March. General Omar Bradley also did not like the main effort being with the British, and so he allowed the U.S. Third Army under General George Patton to make a crossing on the 22nd of March at the village of Oppenheim near Mainz in an attempt to steal the press from the British operation. And it's much quoted that Patton claimed that he wanted Bradley to announce it to the press that he'd beaten Montgomery because there is this modern belief that Patton and Montgomery were rivals. It's not actually. It was Bradley was more of a rival to Montgomery because they were both Army Group commanders, and Patton didn't really figure much into to Montgomery's thinking because Patton was just an Army commander. So it's actually very much a modern creation from General Omar Bradley's memoirs. As I said, Operation Plunder is not an exclusively British operation, as the U.S. 9th Army under General William Bill Simpson was attached to the 21st Army Group, attacking south of the British 2nd Army under General Miles Dempsey. In fact, General Simpson is known to have preferred serving under Montgomery rather than Bradley, as he felt Bradley and the commander of the U.S. First Army, General Courtney Hodges, were prima donnas and prone to tantrums, and he felt that General Patton was a media clown. And so him working under General Montgomery was actually more comfortable for him because he liked the cold and professional handling of the British military. The plan called for a crossing at the town of Rees, the British 30 Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, and the British 12th Corps under Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie, who, if anyone is a fan of history, knew he was actually commanding British troops in the 8th Army before Montgomery. And then there was an attack at the town of Wesel by the 1st Special Service Brigade, or the 1st Commando Brigade as it's also colloquially known as, under Brigadier Derek Mills Roberts. And then south of the River Leap and south of Wesel by the U.S. 16th Corps under Lieutenant General John Anderson. As part of the crossing plan, Operation Varsity was an airborne operation involving the 18th Airborne Corps under command of Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, who had commanded every major airborne operation for the U.S. Army in the war in Europe. And it involved two divisions, the British 6th Airborne Division, which had the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion in its 3rd Parachute Brigade, and the U.S. 17th Airborne Division in its first ever airborne operation, although it did see combat in the Battle of the Bulge as all the airborne troops from the U.S. Army had moved in to support and stop the attack, and so it had functioned in a ground role. There was actually a 3rd division originally designed to attack with it, which was the U.S. 13th Airborne Division, who had never seen any action at all, and they were going to be dropped along with them. Unfortunately, they had to be removed from lack of aircraft. The missions of the airborne forces were to land after the crossings had begun and seize some high ground and bridges to help exploit the crossing. The lessons from Operation Overlord and Market Garden had been learned and applied, making this the single largest one-day airborne drop in history, and a daylight drop close to their objectives, and were also close and within easy reach of the ground forces. So what they learned from Operation Overlord was you needed to be close to your ground forces, just like they had landed on D-Day, and they realized they needed a daylight drop so the troops could assemble quickly and get to their targets and actually be effective without getting lost. And they also needed to be almost on top of their objectives because they realized at Operation Market Garden, some of the distances the airborne forces had to travel to have perfect landing zones didn't work very well. And so it's a very well thought out, well planned operation. Canada's role in both operations is quite small, with the 1st Parachute Battalion within 3rd Parachute Brigade only being one of 9 infantry battalions to land, and actually earmarked to be the 2nd Battalion to land from 3rd Parachute Battalion, and then the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade being attached to the British 51st Highland Division. What makes the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade stand out was that it was often referred to as the Highland Brigade during the war and in most post-war writings. It earned this nickname because it was actually the only Canadian Army brigade that was made up of 3 Highlander Scottish regiments. And it was made up of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, who had fought at Outhie and had also landed at the Scheldt Estuary during Operation Switchback, the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders, and the Highland Light Infantry of Canada, the other battalion that landed at Operation Switchback. The unit selected to go over first this time was the Highland Light Infantry. It was going to be also a unique operation in that the Royal Navy moved 36 landing craft overseas, or overland, with the help with the crossing, a first ever for the Northwest European campaign, because every other crossing had been across relatively small and easy rivers. So they'd never actually had to use landing craft. They'd only ever used Buffalo landing vehicle tracked, or they'd used ducks and the British equivalent called a terrapin. So this was going to be the first time when they were actually going to use landing craft that they actually drove across. And this was a massive attempt to strike across the Rhine River and drive deep into the heart of Germany. Operation Plunder, the 9th Brigade crosses the Rhine, 23 March to 28 March 1945. So the map on the left-hand side is actually showing the attack of the 2 British battalions that were initially made the crossing, and then where the Highland Light Infantry basically charged right down the center to take this really difficult and challenging objective. And the picture beside it is actually of B Company of the Highland Light Infantry in their universal carrier, and it's Company Sergeant Major R.E. Bryant, Private Mullen, and Private Galbraith, and that's actually in the village of Speldrop. The beginning of Operation Plunder was a thunderous bombardment by almost 5,000 artillery pieces, which began at 5 p.m. on the 23rd of March, 1945. It involved field, medium, heavy, anti-tank, and anti-aircraft guns, all shooting at the German east-held side of the bank. Many Canadian artillery units, stationed all along the Rhine, participated from the town of Wesel as far as Nijmegen, shooting distractionary shoots, fire support missions, suppression missions, and at the worst of all, diversionary attacks. The air forces also were involved in this attack, including a very, very heavy raid on the town of Wesel. The attack by the 51st Highland Division went in about 5 hours before the main effort, which was actually farther south, and in the area by the 15th Scottish Division. The goal was to move inland from the river, take some villages, and unbalance the German response by hitting them where they did not expect and hard to counterattack. Called Operation Turnscrew, this codename was for the action involving the 51st Highland Division north of and around Rees, and involved about 150 landing vehicle tracked called Buffaloes and Sherman duplex drive amphibious tanks, all going across in the first wave. The attacking brigade on the left was the 154th Brigade, with the 7th Black Watch and 7th Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders going across at about 9 p.m., followed by the 1st Black Watch, who were to capture the villages of Klein Esserden and Speldrop. They suffered losses from mines in landed vehicles and men, and the engineers who came across began to clear the banks of the river so that the following troops could land with ease. Moving inland towards the villages is when things began to go badly for the British. The 1st Black Watch lost the company commander leading the attack on Klein-Esserden, and the forward observation officer's carrier was lost to a mine, and quickly they lost their artillery link. And the Germans decided to start mortaring them. They did capture the very outskirts of the village and made it to the town of Speldrop by about 6 a.m. on the 24th, but they were under increasing pressure from the German paratroopers that were defending the area. The British were eventually pushed out of Speldrop, with one British platoon and many of the wounded cut off, but not somehow overrun inside of the town, and the situation was not looking good. The first Canadians to cross the Rhine were in fact under the command of Captain Donald Pierce and 9 other ranks from the Highland Light Infantry who came across in the attacking wave of the 154th Brigade to reconnoiter the area where the brigade was going to land, assemble, and then to act as guides. At 3:45 a.m., the Highland Light Infantry were ordered to cross the Rhine, and by 4:25 a.m., they were boarding their buffaloes just north of the village of Honnepole, and an hour later, they were assembling just south of the town of Klein-Esserden on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Their original mission had been to expand the bridgehead by moving and capturing the village of Bienen, but this was changed because they needed to relieve the Black Watch, 1st Battalion of the Black Watch, at Speldrop. The Highland Light Infantry went into the attack late on the 24th of March, 1945, against fairly strong resistance, but with artillery support, including 2 batteries of 7.2-inch heavy guns. They were able to reach the village, which began a 2-day house-to-house fight. The Germans held and fought for every single house, with the Highlanders having to use their Wasp flamethrower carriers to burn many of them out. The fighting in the town of Speldrop lasted until the 25th of March, when the Canadians were finally able to rescue the trapped men of the 1st Battalion of the Black Watch. The cost was light, surprisingly, in contrast to the intensity of the battle as described in the war diaries and the official histories, with the Highland Light Infantry only losing 10 men killed and 23 wounded over the course of the 2 days. By the afternoon of the 24th of March, had the rest of the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade, under command of Brigadier General Jim Rockingham, later of Korean fame, crossing the Rhine, and the Highland Light Infantry fell back under their command. The next Canadians to go into action were the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders, who captured the village of Greetherbush quite easily, and then the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, who attacked Bienen, the original Highland Light Infantry objective, on the 25th of March, only to get held up and pinned down in the face of strong German fire. They reformed, and with more support, this time in the form of Wasp carriers and Archer self-propelled artillery pieces from 3rd Anti-Tank Regiment, finally made it to the southern part of the village, but at a terrible cost of 43 killed and 71 wounded. The Highland Light Infantry were brought up, along with more archers from 3AT to help clear the town. After a night of tough fighting, they cleared out the last of the defenders by the early morning of the 26th of March. The Canadians did not have tank support because the only tanks to get across at that point had been the duplex drive tanks, and they weren't that enough of them to go around. The last actions carried out on this part of the battle were carried out by the North Shore Regiment, who had been borrowed from the 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade. They attacked towards the village of Milligan, about a mile northeast of Bienen, and they attacked about noon on the 26th of March, with artillery and tank support, which had finally arrived, and it was a complete success, but at the cost of their CO, Lieutenant Colonel W.H. Rowley, who was killed early in the battle. The next unit to be lent to the 9th Canadian Brigade was the Canadian Scottish Regiment, this time from the 7th Canadian Brigade, and by the 27th of March, the 3rd Canadian Divisional Headquarters was across, and the rest of the 7th Brigade crossed as well, and assumed control of the left-hand side of the Rhine bridgehead. The 8th Canadian Brigade finally got to cross on the 28th of March, and with that, the full division reverted back to the 2nd Canadian Corps, who now took over the entire western sector of the area with the goal to attack into the Netherlands and establish more bridges across the Rhine. Operation Plunder, often called the Battle of the Rhine on the left flank, they crossed, and one of the things that's really important about this battle is that our tanks and most of the Canadian troops were actually on the western bank shooting into the other side of the Rhine. to keep the Germans suppressed. And it was a really, really tough fight, but it was very complicated at times for the Canadians. And unfortunately, you can go to most of these towns today because they're just north of the town of Rees, but there's no memorials. And so when you're walking this ground and you're seeing it, you kind of have to use your imagination a little bit to understand, because of the changes in the terrain, where you're standing and what's happening around you. But it was a hugely successful operation. Now, the 3rd Canadian Division, of course, had led Canada's attack in D-Day. It led the attack during the Battle of the Scheldt, specifically Operation Switchback. And then, of course, it had led the attack in Operation Veritable and Blockbuster. So this was the 4th time they were leading a major assault, and it was the 4th time they had basically done an amphibious attack or a crossing of significant nature. And that is one of the reasons why they were notoriously called the Water Rats, which is the name that the Canadians hated, but Montgomery gave to them. I don't think they get called that today, but that is actually the basis of why they're called the Water Rats. So this photo on the left-hand side is the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry's moving up. That's one of the Rhine River dikes. It's not far that far north of Rees, and they're getting ready to literally go across, jump into the buffalo carriers, who would ferry them across, and then drop them off, and then they would walk into position. Now, the other photo on the top right is the Canadian Grenadier Guards from the 4th Canadian Armored Division. And because they didn't have amphibious tanks, they quite literally lined the river. These guys are actually opposite Emmerich. And all of those tubes are from the artillery rounds. And they basically use the tanks firing their 75 millimeter and 17-pounder guns into German positions to suppress them and allow the Canadians coming up on the eastern bank to have some fire support. And it worked quite well. The bottom one, and I made a mistake there. That's a quote. The caption is wrong. It's actually not at Emmerich. I took that from that photo, and it turns out the Blackfriars Bridge is actually at Rise. So there's an error on that photo. But that's the Royal Canadian Engineers building the Blackfriars Bridge at Rise. And that's a squadron of engineers, and it's a huge river. It turns out that the Blackfriars Bridge was the longest bridge at almost 1,800 meters crossing the Rhine, and it was built by the Canadians. Operation Varsity, the largest airborne operation in history. So the map on the left-hand side is the 6th Airborne's part in Operation Varsity. So it's all 3 of the brigades taking what they were supposed to get. So the Canadians are actually on the very left-hand side of the map, with their planned drop zone, and they were basically going to attack into the forest and take a feature. But these are the 2 airborne operations, and their job was to basically hold this ground and take it so that we could exploit through it, and any of the bridges and crossings wouldn't be lost to the Germans. And the other map is a much more detailed kind of where things are and who was doing what to whom, where some of the objectives are. And that's a 3rd Airborne, 3rd Parachute Brigade map. Operation Varsity began at 10 a.m. on the 24th of March, with the largest single drop in history taking place. All of the troops in the 2 attacking divisions dropped the same day and within the same period of time by 1,589 transport aircraft and 1,337 gliders, which is an unbelievable amount. And that's before all of the escorting fighters and all the fighter bombers and bombers that were trying to suppress the enemy defenses and protecting them from the Luftwaffe and German defenses. That's just the transport aircraft and gliders that took the 2 divisions into action. And just as a quick note, a British Airborne Brigade division is smaller than a regular division. It has 3 brigades, but there's less troops and less heavy equipment in each of the 2 parachute brigades, with the glider or air landing brigade, as they called it, essentially being equivalent to a regular brigade with all of its anti-armor and heavy weapons being in the glider-borne troops. The 1st Canadian Parachute Brigade was part of the 6th Airborne Division and was led by Lieutenant Colonel J.A. Jeff Nicholin, a Normandy veteran and a former Winnipeg Blue Bomber who had been part of the Grey Cup winning team in 1939 and the 2 previous years when the Winnipeg Blue Bombers had lost. And they landed just north of Deersfort Wood into Drop Zone Alpha. The drop had the men spread widely over the drop zone due to the high speed of the aircraft trying to avoid the heavy German flak that the Germans had put up as a greeting to the Allied air offensive. Several aircraft were shot down and damaged by this fire, and as the Canadians jumped, some of them had to leap from burning aircraft. C Company of the 1st Battalion, Canadian Parachute Regiment, were the first to land and suffered heavy casualties in the fierce German machine gun fire, wounding their company commander and killing the 2 IC. The sergeants quickly took over and they led a frontal attack on the German defenders, who also happened to be German paratroopers, holding some houses on the eastern edge of the drop zone. Unfortunately, many Canadians were caught in the trees with their parachutes, including their CO, Colonel Nicklin, who was shot by the Germans as he was hanging from his parachute. The deputy commanding officer, Major Fraser Eddy, quickly assumed command of the battalion and moved to take and clear its objectives, the Schnappenberg feature, which they had completed by 11:30 that morning. The fighting was heavy, and the Canadians suffered 23 killed, including Lieutenant Colonel Nicklin, 40 wounded, and 2 men captured by the Germans. The real problem for the Canadians, although, after they'd secured their objectives, was that they had a huge number of prisoners, which, unfortunately, amounted almost to the same number of men in the battalion, and it was becoming difficult to keep them under control. The number of German dead was uncounted, but was considered to be quite significant. One of the most important parts of this fighting was that one of the battalion medical orderlies, Corporal George Topham, had performed actions that led to him being awarded the 4th Victoria Cross to Canadians in Northwest European Campaign. Now, Corporal George Topham was not a member of the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps, because medical orderlies are actually infantrymen that are acting in a medical orderly role. So he's actually an infantryman and a paratrooper. 2 other medical orderlies went out to rescue a wounded man, but were cut down. And so Corporal Topham went forward under his own initiative to the man through intense fire to try to save him. As he was kneeling beside the man administering first aid and the now 2 dead medical orderlies, he was struck in his face. Specifically, he was shot through the nose. Despite heavy bleeding and intense pain, he continued to work on the man, and then he picked him up, carried him to safely through the enemy fire, and brought him to safety. He refused any treatment and continued to work for 2 more hours until all the unit's casualties on the drop zones had been cleared. After that, and when he was returning to his own company, still refusing evacuation, a universal carrier with ammunition was hit nearby him and began to burn and cook off. With mortar bombs from the Germans still falling all around and orders from a veteran officer not to approach, he stormed out alone and rescued the 3 men trapped in the carrier, unfortunately, one of which died almost immediately after being rescued. Corporal Topham then treated the other 2 men and ordered and arranged their evacuation, and those 2 other men survived. By the evening of the 24th of March, 1945, the leading elements of the 15th Scottish Division had successfully linked up with elements of the 6th British Airborne Division, making this operation a complete success. But it was costly in terms of casualties and planes, but the Allies went across the Rhine. The British 6th Airborne Division recorded a total of 1,300 casualties in that 24-hour period. So this battle is not really, really well documented, but the top photo is a couple of men from the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. They're actually dug in and are fighting back near Burgerfirth Wald on the 24th of March. So it's not actually an in-action photo, but it's about as real-time photo of the battle as you can get. And the very far photo is the link-up of the Reconnaissance Battalion, the 15th Scottish Division Reconnaissance Regiment, linking up in their Daimler Scout cars with paratroopers from the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. And the center photo, of course, is Frederick George Topham, VC, from the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. You notice he's wearing parachute markings complete. After the war, actually, he shied away very much from the military and anything about his heroics. He worked for a very short time as a police officer and then worked in transit. And his medals ended up, when he died, his family in his will had wanted them sold. And so it turned out that the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada and the Canadian War Museum and a few other people did a massive fundraising and paid about $300,000 for his medals so they could retain in collection of the Canadian War Museum. Operation Plunder and Varsity ends. After linking up with the airborne forces and successfully taking all of the objectives, the Allies had to bridge the Rhine to get all of their heavy equipment and supplies across. The first bridge was established by midnight on the 24th of March, and over the next 3 days, 12 more bridges were built, including the Canadian engineers at Rees building the Blackfriars Bridge. By that time, the Allies had pushed across 14 divisions, with more moving over every single day. The same day that the 8th Brigade, Canadian Brigade, crossed to join the 3rd Canadian Division, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division also began their crossing and was fully over by the end of the 29th of March, and followed shortly thereafter by the 4th Canadian Armored Division. The 2nd Canadian Armored Infantry Division began Operation Haymaker, which was the 2nd Canadian Corps' drive north, while the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division attacked east into the town of Emmerich and into the Netherlands, successfully capturing it. The British First Corps at this point left the 1st Canadian Army and was replaced in line and the crossing of the Rhine by the 1st Canadian Corps under Lieutenant General Charles Fuchs, who had arrived from Italy back in the end of February and had finished their reset and were ready to come into the line in the western sector, while the 2nd Canadian Corps under Guy Simons would command the eastern sector, which would be fighting in and out of Germany and the Netherlands. Now, Operation Goldflake was significant because as the 1st Canadian Army, it was the first time that the two corps were going to fight together in the Second World War, and it's only going to be for about the last month of the war. And so while Operation Plunder and Varsity were happening, the 1st Canadian Corps was actually refitting, changing out all of its weapons. It went from Thompson submachine guns to Sten guns, tanks and equipment, and there was a little bit of friction because, of course, they'd been fighting longer than the 2nd Canadian Corps and felt that they didn't need to know how to fight the Germans because Italy had been under-supported and under-equipped. So there's an interesting story about that. But we're actually going to talk about the 1st Canadian Corps and the 2nd Canadian Corps in their drives to liberate the Netherlands the next time we do our battlefield talk. Canadian fallen about this battle are really in one cemetery. Most of the Canadians who fell in Operation Plunder and Varsity were taken back to Grozebeek Canadian War Cemetery in the Netherlands because the 1st Canadian Army Commander, General Harry Kruger, had given an order that all Canadian soldiers who fell would not be buried in Germany. They would not be buried on enemy soil. And so all of them got hauled back as far as Grozebeek, which is quite a significant operation. Next time we visit cemeteries, we're actually going to go and visit the fallen from the next cemetery. We're going to be actually finally moving into a cemetery back into the Netherlands. The Germans have several cemeteries in the area, mostly fairly small and mostly near where they fell. Some of them are in local towns, but there is one larger German cemetery in the area as well. That's always worth a visit. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to thank you, Rob. Thanks again for all your time, all your passion, and thank you everybody for tuning in. Just letting you know that we have these monthly until May. So the next one is April 15th at 7 p.m. Berlin time, same time, and it'll be Advance on the Northern Front, the Netherlands campaign. You want to give a little bit of a teaser, Rob, for this one, or keep it until next time?
No, I'll give a little teaser. So what we're going to be talking about is the 1st Canadian Corps now moving into action and parts of the 2nd Canadian Corps in their drives through the liberation of the Netherlands, starting actually quite honestly at Arnhem, which is the failed battle in September of 44, and driving ourselves north, as far north as the North Sea and Groningen. And so the whole, it'll be basically the big drive across from the 1st till the 24th or 25th of April, 1945, as we strove to liberate town after town in the Netherlands.
Perfect. Well, we'll see everyone in April, and I'm wishing you a great day. Bye.
Have a nice day, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.